Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why there's no such thing as a liberal artist. Because for the life of my channel, I've heard people say that there's no such thing as good conservative art, and I think that statement is being reflected more and more. But I'm here to say that the only kind of art that is actually art is conservative art. Liberals cannot actually create art. Or, to put it in an artistic sense, by paraphrasing that great conservative artist, J.R.R. Tolkien, evil cannot create anything new. They can only corrupt and ruin what good forces have invented or made. But before we get there, and speaking of creating under a conservative ideal, I have 3 graphic novels, each of them built upon the traditional idea of a virtuous hero. There are 2 links in the description for those 3 graphic novels, 2 superhero graphic novels, and 1 sword and sorcery. You're looking at some of the spectacular art from those in the background, and I will play a short trailer for one of my graphic novels at the end of this video if you want to learn more about the stories that one of those graphic novels delve into. And they are stories based upon creation by merit and exploring traditional ideas like the virtuous hero. So if any of that looks or sounds appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and see if one of my graphic novels is for you. But back to proving my bold claims. Well, I guess I'll start here. As you'll notice, when I gave that quote from Tolkien, I didn't say it was a quote. I said it was a paraphrase, because it is a paraphrase of several things that Tolkien said within different works that he created. As far as I know, anyways. If someone wants to correct me on that in the comments, you go right ahead. But he does make statements, like in the Return of the King, where he says, "The shadows that bred them can only mock. It cannot make, not real new things of its own." Or more to the point, he says in the Silmarillion, "And its object is art, not power. Subcreation, not dominion and tyrannous reforming of creation." So when you look at that quote, what is he doing? He's defining art as subcreation, and he's talking about power as being used as a dominating and tyrannous force that reforms what actually is, that reforms creation. And I would completely agree. He's getting back to the heart of what art actually is. Now, I'll get back to Tolkien and talk about that in a little bit, but I want to put a pin in that and go back to the point which made me think about this over the last couple of weeks. And that was a video done by Richard Meyer, which is titled, "The Worst Thing About Culture War is that it forced conservatives to become artists." But funny enough, you would think that I would disagree with Richard on this point, whereas I actually agree with him in a strange sort of way. Because really what he's talking about is creation out of whole cloth. Now that's an old idiom, but it perfectly fits with what I'm talking about, because it means to create something completely out of falsehood. And really, that's what, in his mind, and in the mind of many people today, that is what art actually is. It's the creation of something completely new. And I can tell you right now, I can't even count the amount of times I have got people looking at what I have created, my graphic novels, and the characters that I have created, and said to me, "That's garbage." Why? Because you're not creating anything new. Why? Because they think that actual artists create something completely new, when artists and art is not the creation of something completely new. It is, as Tolkien stated briefly in the Silmarillion, art is subcreation. It works with what already is. So I would agree with Richard in the fact that if you're viewing art as something which is a creation out of whole cloth, a fabrication, nothing but a lie, then yes, conservatives create bad, quote-unquote, art. Because, first of all, that's not art, and second of all, that's not how conservatives think, so obviously they're going to create something bad when they're trying to create a complete fabrication. So, in order to go on, I suppose I should define what art actually is. And I'm sure that many people will want to put in the comments saying, "Well, that's not what art actually is," or "That's not my definition of art." Well, good for you. You can have your own definition of things that you make up for yourself. That doesn't mean it's real. And other people, especially other movements like your quote-unquote progressive movements, they can make up definitions for things, definitions that suit their ideology. That doesn't mean that it's real. And that's the point. A definition of something should go back to the objective reality of what is. And the objective reality of what is, the definition for art that has been around since ancient times, going back to a minimum of Aristotle in the 4th century BC and continuing through the majority of history within Western civilization right up until the last couple of hundred years. Art was defined as something much broader and at the same time much narrower than how we define it today. And it was a definition based upon what is real. It is a logical and rational definition of what art is, because again, logic and reason go back to what is real. And in that sense, yes, it was a more rigid and more defined definition than what most people think about today, because a lot of people would throw into the definition of art the creation of things that are so-called unreal. But the logical definition of art is no, it's based on something real. But it was also much broader, as I said, because the ancients and medievals talked about art in a much broader sense. There was an art of shipbuilding, an art of architecture. There was the art of philosophy, the art of natural science. And so it is that they would boil things down, things that we define as art today, like paintings or sculptures, into the art of proportionality. But to get right down to it, the definition would be the ability to take an image from your mind, that is to say, to take something from your imagination and to translate it into exterior matter. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means if you're talking about the art of shipbuilding, if you have in your mind an image of a good ship and you create that good ship according to the rules of reality, not only in your mind, but then within a substantial way within this world, if it acts according to the rules of reality, it will be a good ship. If it doesn't, it will sink. If you create as an architect a building in your mind and then build it in the real world, if it is in accord with the rules of reality, it will stand up. If it isn't, it will fall down. Thus it is the ability to take that image from your mind and translate it into external matter. If it is a poor or bad translation into external matter, that thing that you have created simply will not work properly, at the very least will not work properly as you imagined it in your mind. So the point is, in order to be artistic, you need to, in your mind, be able to shape ideas according to reality well enough so that when you translate them into external matter, they continue to operate in the same way. That is the process of art. And again, that works for the things that we now call art today, the very narrow definitions that we give art to today. If you're taking an image from your mind and then painting it on a canvas, how do those rules apply? Well, those rules apply by, as I mentioned, painting the picture according to things like proportionality. And if you can't do that correctly, then you're not able to transmit what that idea is from your mind to the canvas, to the mind of the person viewing what you have created. And although I have very little expertise in this, I should listen to someone like one of my subscribers who is sound engraver, who talks about music all the time. I would say the same thing is true for music, but that would be with proportions like harmony. So it involves a secondary step. The secondary step is I'm taking an image from my mind and creating it within notes, within splashes on a page, so that when someone who is not me views the same thing that I have created, they create an image in their mind, which is the same image that I created in my mind. If you can't do that, it's not good art. To some extent, if you can't do that, it might not even be art at all. Now, that would be the perfection of the process. As human beings, we don't work in perfection, so we have to deal with the imperfection of trying to get that right as much as possible. But let's take that kind of idea and apply it to storytelling, because I'm a storyteller, and I talk about creation of stories, especially heroic story, which, by the way, true heroic stories, once again, go back to what is real. But I'll set that aside and only mention it briefly here today. But the thing about creating a story, well, first of all, we have to acknowledge the very thing that Aristotle, again in the 4th century BC, acknowledged, that storytelling is, first of all, one of the easiest mediums to corrupt. So many of us, I'm sure, many a times, have looked at something which called itself a story and didn't realize that it wasn't actually a story. it was something completely different. But again, I'll get to that more in a moment. And I honestly think this is the reason why this form of art, storytelling, has developed a secondary class to help it actually come into existence. And that secondary class, besides the creator themselves, is the editor. Now, I'm sure if you're an architect or a shipbuilder, you might have someone go over your plans, but I don't think they have editors. If you're a master shipbuilder, you're the one who's supposed to be the editor of your own work. You'll have someone look over it to make sure that you're not too close to this entire thing and you're not missing something, but you don't get someone to edit your work. But we have editors for storytelling because, once again, storytelling is so easily corruptible. But what is the job of an editor? An editor that actually works correctly, because there are many editors out there today who don't work correctly. But the job of an editor, traditionally, and according to merit, is to, sometimes even instinctually, but is to apply the rules of reality to your work to make sure that it actually follows the rules of reality. The editor is there because our kinds of storytelling have become so corrupted that that image in your mind no longer follows the pattern of what is real enough for you to actually just put it out there in the world. So you need a secondary person to take their knowledge of what is real and how it applies to story and to check all of the falsehoods that you have created within your story. And some of those falsehoods might simply be how the language that you're working in actually works correctly and can produce the best transmission of those ideas which you are putting down on a page. So they'll say, no, this is a run-on sentence. No, this sentence doesn't make any sense the way that you have written it down. No, these words don't actually need to be there. You're just cluttering up the idea of what you're trying to say. There's that kind of editing. And again, that's based upon how the language works, which is based upon the ability of that language to bring about an image within the mind of the person that is actually real. And this, by the way, all goes back to that definition that Aristotle used when he described storytelling, once again, back in the 4th century and continued on since then, that storytelling, first of all, is a rhetorical argument, and secondarily, is a reflection of reality. Again, I'll get into more of that in a moment. But part of that reflection of reality, once again, is the fact that one of the things an editor needs to do is make sure your story has continuity. Why? Because reality has continuity. And if you're not putting continuity into your story, if something just pops up out of the blue or contradicts the fundamental thing that you had put as a driving part of your story earlier in your story, then no, the editor is not going to let it stand. They're going to say, change this. And even more than that, part of what the editor is doing, again, sometimes just instinctually, is to look at how your characters act, to understand how human beings actually work, and to tell you, no, change that. A human being would not act this way. Or at the very least, if you have one of your characters as a human being act this way, you're going to have to establish it with continuity prior to this point within your story. There's a really good example of this, which I talk about every once in a while, which is Chris Claremont's writing of the Dark Phoenix saga for Marvel Comics. The editor-in-chief at that time was Jim Shooter, and he relates the story as follows, very briefly. He said Chris Claremont came to him and told him this story. If you don't know it, it's basically about this girl, Jean Grey. She is a telepath and also has psychic powers besides that. But she gets imbued with this force, which is a primal force of the universe called the Phoenix Force. And part of what she does within this story is, first of all, destroy an entire starship worth of people, because she goes off into the universe where there are aliens, and aliens are just faux human beings. So she destroys and kills everybody on this starship, and then from there moves on to destroy an entire planet worth of, again, faux human beings. And Chris Claremont wanted to end this story by having this force drained out of Jean Grey and have her go back to being what she was at the beginning, which was a shy schoolgirl. And Jim Shooter relates the story that he said to Chris Claremont, no, if you're writing this story, that's not how you're going to end it. And the reason he gave was, it's because human beings do not work that way. You do not get to go from a shy schoolgirl to a mass murderer of an entire planet and then go back to being a shy schoolgirl. That's not how human beings work. And again, he relates, he says, Chris Claremont said to him, you're just trying to impose some kind of moral imperative on my story, And Jim Shooter said back to him, "No, I'm not. What you have written is quite simply a bad story." Why? Because human beings don't work that way. And by the way they rectified this was, yes, they went with Jim Shooter because, again, he's the editor-in-chief, and at the end of the story, Jean Grey had to die. And secondarily, it's funny because this touches on and brings together a few of the different things that I've been talking about today. Jim Shooter was telling him, no, this is not a good story because this is not how human beings act. And he was drawing that back to the reality of how human beings actually exist. But at the same time, Chris Claremont was accusing him of being moralistic. Why? Well, because even though he wasn't being moralistic, morality ties itself back to what? It ties itself back to the reality of how human beings exist. So you could see where his confusion might have come up in that conversation. And I would add on top of that, he's writing about heroes, and I would say, once again, heroes draw themselves right back to the reality of how human beings exist. So if we take all of that and we apply it to art, and that definition to art, what does actual art look like, which is a conservative way of looking at art? Well, art exists in a way that is connected to the true, the good, and the beautiful. Why? Because the true is what is real. It is reality. And those things are lumped together in that trinity because what is true is also good and beautiful. What is good is also true and beautiful. What is beautiful is also true and good. And so, as Tolkien referenced, the actual production of art is subcreation. It is to take something that is real and to represent it. And again, other ways to describe that in my mind, I go back to, which I'm sure is probably an apocryphal quote that was attributed to, I believe, Michelangelo when he was carving the sculpture of David. Someone asked him how he created such beautiful statues, and he said, "I don't create anything. All I do is chip away the extra parts of the marble until the statue is revealed." Or going back to that old idiom, or it might be really a fable of saying, truth is like a lion. If someone attacks a lion, you don't defend the lion. You simply open up the cage door and let it free. This is all part and parcel how a conservative actually creates. You don't create a falsehood. You don't try to unleash upon the world something that you have created specifically yourself. No, you're working with what is in order to bring a form of what is into reality. And some people might be saying, well, that's awful limited. That's awful narrow and would only produce a very small set of things which you would just reproduce over and over again. And I would say, no, quite the opposite is the case. As human beings, we have access to the ability to create in an infinite manner. But again, that creation is dependent upon working with the rules of reality, which is to say, we have the infinite ability to create, but creation only goes in one direction. And what is that direction? Well, that direction is towards what is real. And that's not contradictory. You can have a line which extends infinitely and a line that extends infinitely only in one direction. Those things are not contrary. And here's where we get to the point of where we can understand that liberals can't actually create art. Why? Because they're creating out of whole cloth. They're fabricating something. They're lying. They're trying to create art in the other direction when art can't be created in the direction of what is not. Now, I'll say the following, and I've said the following since the beginning of my channel. If you're a liberal in the sense of the original idea of what liberalism was, which is hundreds of years old, that is to say, to liberate people from a false notion of what is real in order to better understand what is real, then yeah, you go ahead and be a liberal in that sense. And yes, you can create. But as I said, that was the original idea of liberalism. And that was hundreds of years ago. And it very, very quickly fell away from that idea or that ideal of how to act and became liberation of human beings from rules, because rules are constrictive and therefore bad. Therefore, we must liberate people from any and all rules, or at the very least, liberate them from some rules which are actually simply based on reality. I'm sorry, but if that's the way you think, and a lot of us think that way, myself included, in an unknown manner because we have been trained to think that way by our societies. But if you think that way, that's not a mindset that can actually produce anything new. That's not a mindset that can create. And since art is a form of subcreation, then no. The liberal of the liberals that we see around us today, the majority of them, which think that liberty is the freedom from any and all rules, or at the very least, the reservation on the individual's part to liberate themselves from any and all rules, should they choose to do so, is a false notion. That's not actual liberty. Again, going back to the ancient definition of what liberty is, the ancient definition of liberty, again, which continued on through most of Western civilization up until the last couple of hundred years, is the freedom to do what is right. Or to put it another way, the freedom to do what is real. The freedom to act in accord with reality. That's what liberty is. And if that's not your definition of liberty, and you're a liberal according to the definition of liberty, which is simply the freedom to do whatever you want, you cannot create anything real based upon that notion. Now you can create. You can create complete fabrications. You can create lies. And you might be able even to create things which people want to hear. But that's not to say that it's a story. That's not to say that it's actual art. It is something else completely if that is the case. And once again, focusing on storytelling, if you're doing that, you're not creating a story. You're creating, let's say, a panegyric, which is the exalting of the virtues or so-called virtues of some idea. Or you're just a propagandist. You're teaching people something in a way that gets around their rational mind. That's what propaganda is. So you're using what you call a story simply as a teaching tool, but it's not a story. Then again, you might revel in it. Other people might revel in it. I would say to their detriment, because they're training their minds to accept something which is not real, which they will then apply to their real lives and wonder why reality is smacking them to the ground and not understand it. But at the same time, setting all of that aside, I would say, if that's what you're doing, you're not creating art, because that's not what art is. And this goes back to, again, something I covered from the first of my channel. It was an interview I covered with the person who, at that time, was in operational control of Marvel Comics. And she literally said within that interview that Marvel superheroes and stories should be used to push positive ideas. And that's what she defined in part as a story. That's what she, as the vice president of content for Marvel Comics, was telling them to produce as a story. But that's not a story. And as I, again, have said from the beginning of my channel, that is taking ideas and putting them in the mask of being characters. And the reason why they do that, again, is propagandistic. They want to teach you something in a way that gets around your rational mind. So they take these ideas, put them in the mask of being an actual character, which they're not, because a character is a reflection of a person. And these are not persons. These are a reflection of ideas. They're putting in the mask of being a character so that you will emotionally identify with that character for certain reasons, usually identity politics, so that you will then accept the so-called character as a so-called person and thus accept what they actually are, which is the idea behind them. And again, that entire thing is a panegyric that leads into propaganda. It's not a story. You can call it a story all you want. It's not a story, and it's not art. And again, I'm sure someone is probably typing in the comments, well, this all depends upon your limited definition of what art is, and I don't believe that art is that thing. Well, I really don't care what you believe. That's all subjective. What you think, know, or believe, that's subjective. It doesn't mean a hill of beans to what actually is. And hey, if you can come up with a definition for what art is according to what is real and have it stand the test of time and pressures and exercising of over 3,000 years, then you go ahead and do so. Let's see what actually comes of that in 3,000 years. But if you can't do so, let's go with what is real. You can sit over in your little corner and play with your fantasies all you want. That doesn't make them stories. That doesn't make them art. And to take this entire thing one step further, I'm sure someone is probably thinking within their minds, yeah, but that form of what we call art is much more detailed and much more rich than what I'm describing as art. And I would, once again, come back to the fact that, well, if you had actual conservative art, especially based upon the idea that not only you can create infinitely, but you have a tie to something which is infinite, then you have infinite abilities to do so. And if you create actual good conservative art, you can do it in an infinite way. Whereas the ideology that says the opposite, the ideology that comes from liberty, is simply ignoring all rules because I'm the creator unto myself, which can determine whether or not the rules of reality apply to me. That is a limited way of thinking. That is enslavement to a lie. That, in the expression of many of the ideologies that flow from it, is the idea that I'm simply what is made up of me in atoms and energy and etc. But those things are completely limited, and notions based upon them are completely limited. And to boil the entire thing down into one simple and powerful way of understanding all that I have just said, it's simply that if you cannot create according to what is true, good, and beautiful, then what you're creating is a lie, and therefore can never be art. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, there are 2 links in the description for my 3 graphic novels that focus on the traditional virtuous idea of a hero, using merit-based techniques to create the story and the art. So if any of that sounds or looks appealing to you at all, click on one of those links in the description and go on over and order yourself a copy of one of my graphic novels today. And as I mentioned, right after I'm done talking here in a moment, I will be playing one of the trailers for my graphic novels if you want to know a little bit more about the story. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later. Bye.
An age ago, the beating heart of our people was a king who knew only victory. He wanted nothing more than an honorable death on the battlefield. Yet, none could match him, and so he wandered the earth, becoming lost in time and tide. Then we too lost our honest purpose, while silk-clad men sat upon the throne. But tremble now, all cities that lay under the stars, for out of the shadows and mists of the land of promise, our courage has been rekindled, our heart has returned, and the world will burn.